A poem addressed to the beloved could be about Christ, or about Sister Beatrice. A note reading, "You are in my every psalm," could be devotional or romantic, or both. This deliberate blurring allowed women to express themselves while staying within the boundaries of safety. It also allows us, centuries later, to glimpse their struggles without ever fully claiming to know them. That restraint is part of their power. Most nun writers did not die famous. Their words were not celebrated. They often died anonymously, their writings buried, confiscated, or entrusted to archives that misfiled them under miscellanea. Their deaths were recorded in short lines. Sister Juliana passed on the feast of Saint Agnes. Sister Maria succumbed to fever in winter. And yet, the letters they left, hidden in bindings, pasted into flyleaves, scribbled in wax tablets, suggest that even as they prepared for death, they kept writing. Why? To be remembered? Perhaps. To confess? Possibly. To connect? Always. Today, scholars, writers, and artists return to these texts with reverence. Not to scandalize, but to understand. Not to extract proof of forbidden love, but to witness the contours of human longing shaped by silence. Their words are now taught in university courses, translated into modern verse, reimagined in plays, novels, and documentaries. They are no longer whispers in the dark. They are voices given breath, centuries after the ink dried. If a nun's letter was burned and forgotten, but the longing behind it survives in the margins of another woman's prayer, has it truly vanished? Or is that how history remembers its quietest truths, not in canon, but in echo? The year is 1480. The Kingdom of Spain, freshly unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, stands at the threshold of vast expansion. The Inquisition has begun to burn in public squares. The conquest of Granada is approaching. Across the ocean, Columbus prepares for his first voyage. Spain is no longer just a kingdom. It is an idea of order, militant, Catholic, and absolute. And within its borders, tucked into the dusty hills outside Seville, sits the convent of Santa Clara, an enclosed house of Franciscan nuns. Founded nearly a century earlier, it now finds itself at the crossroads of church politics, colonial ambition, and feminine resistance. Santa Clara was not remarkable in its architecture or rituals. What made it exceptional was what the church chose not to see. This is the story of how a convent became a quiet sanctuary for forbidden relationships, how its abbess manipulated power in plain sight, and how Rome, distracted by empire, looked the other way. Life within the cloister was supposed to be structured by the Franciscan rule: poverty, obedience, humility. But by the late 15th century, the convent of Santa Clara was drifting. The nuns were no longer uniformly poor. Some came with private incomes, others with servants. The abbess controlled dowries, land, and patronage. And critically, the convent sat just close enough to the city to receive a steady stream of gifts. Candles, books, perfumes, even embroidery thread spun with silver. Daily life remained austere, chanting, fasting, silence, but beneath the surface, something else was blooming. It started with letters, then glances, then exceptions. Within this strictly enclosed space, a code of unspoken allowances developed. Young nuns were paired with older mentors for spiritual formation. Extra time was given for private prayer between pairs. Abbey records show a steady increase in joint penance, a vague term that usually meant shared discipline for private behavior. But what was this behavior? Church records would later call it emotional overattachment. One bishop called it the sin of too much presence. Why didn't the church act? The answer lies in politics. Spain in the late 15th century was a rising star of Catholic supremacy. The monarchy was devout, aggressive, and useful. Rome needed Spain's armies, its gold, its missionary zeal. And convents like Santa Clara, quiet, female-run, financially self-sufficient, were simply not the priority. In fact, the abbess of Santa Clara was well-connected. She was a distant cousin of a cardinal, and had once served as a guest hostess to visiting church dignitaries. Her reports were always flawless on paper. When a visiting friar raised concerns about unusual closeness between nuns, he was reminded politely that Santa Clara had not requested reform and that his authority ended at the gates. Meanwhile, rumors persisted. A Jesuit traveler described hearing strange melodies at dusk from the convent, songs not listed in any liturgical record. A washerwoman claimed to see two white-veiled sisters holding hands through the grill. But such reports were anecdotal, unconfirmed, and easily dismissed. Every convent has its social structure, some formal, some hidden. At Santa Clara, a group of 6 sisters formed what modern historians refer to as the Circle. These were not rebels. They followed the rule, sang at Mass, obeyed the abbess. But they also wrote letters to one another, folded into the margins of psalters, invented shared devotions involving bodily stillness and breathwork, referred to each other using names from the Song of Songs. One letter, discovered sewn into the hem of a scapular decades later, reads, "When you walked past my cell, the air changed. I waited to breathe again until the door closed." The language is lyrical, yes, but also precise. These were relationships framed in scripture, shielded by metaphor, and yet resonating with bodily presence. The abbess knew. Of this we are almost certain. But she allowed it. Why? Perhaps because they didn't threaten authority. Perhaps because, in some strange way, they represented a form of obedience even deeper than rules could command. Another clue to the convent's emotional culture lies in its gift. Historians analyzing inventories from Santa Clara found dozens of small tokens. Embroidered handkerchiefs exchanged, privately braided hair rings, etched icons of saints passed from cell to cell. These were not ordinary communal items. They were personalized, symbolic, and often inscribed. In a log from 1483, the abbess noted that a young novice, Sister Beatrice, had misplaced her devotional cross, and another nun, Sister Ines, had offered her own in silent sacrifice. That cross was later found etched with the words, "For your hands when mine cannot hold." What makes Santa Clara particularly compelling is its embrace of physicality as devotion, not in defiance of church teaching, but by reinterpreting it. According to oral tradition recorded in the 17th century, the sisters practiced a form of kinesthetic prayer, where nuns stood in pairs, eyes closed, breathing in synchrony, hands hovering but not touching. This was framed as an exercise in self-restraint, a way to practice emotional containment and unity with Christ. But the practice also had sensual undertones. As one nun wrote, "In the space between our palms, I feel God wait." This merging of mysticism, discipline, and physical presence reveals a deeply nuanced understanding of desire, not as an enemy, but as a force to be sublimated, redirected, or ritualized. By the early 1500s, reform winds swept through Spain's convent. Bishops called for strict enclosure, increased inspections, and tighter control over nun interactions. Santa Clara's records grow thin after 1505, but fragments survive. A faded songbook with lyrics unlike any known hymn, letters catalogued under Anonymous in a diocesan archive, a crucifix, unusually smooth on one side, as though passed from hand to hand for decades. What happened to the circle? We don't know. Some were reassigned. Some died young. The abbess resigned quietly. The next decade's records are silent. And Rome? Still did not intervene. If Rome looked away not out of ignorance, but calculation, then what does it mean for desire to survive, not in secret, but in sanctioned invisibility? In most convents, an abbess was a figurehead, elected, respected, and revered, but often bound by oversight from bishops, confessors, and church officials. But at Santa Clara, in late 15th century Spain, Abbess Leonor de la Cruz ruled with quiet precision and curious leniency. She was not young, nor was she naive. She had grown up in a noble family, educated by monks, and placed into the convent by choice, not obligation. Her writings reveal a woman of subtle rebellion, The Church asks for discipline, but Christ asks for love. I obey both in measure. Leonor's rule was marked by calm, order, and a strange absence of scandal, despite the private reports of soft irregularities. She did not tolerate chaos, but she also did not punish every deviation. She understood the game. She knew which sins could be spun into devotions, which could be smoothed into ritual, and which must be ignored to preserve a greater order. Some historians now believe that Leonor protected the circle of nuns mentioned in Section 1, not because she approved of emotional entanglement, but because she understood that affection, if managed, could keep women grounded, productive, and loyal. Within Santa Clara, certain pairs of nuns developed spiritual compacts, formal, declared relationships meant to strengthen religious devotion. These were allowed under specific conditions. Both nuns had to be professed. Their time together had to serve shared labor or prayer. They could exchange written commitments, but not physical gift. On paper, this was spiritual mentorship. In practice, it was often more. Some of these spiritual partners lived in adjacent cells, chose to do penance together, and frequently prayed in tandem. They requested to be buried beside one another, a request sometimes granted. One set of such partners, Sisters Clara and Lucia, left behind a partial psalter with marginal inscriptions, including the following: "She is my mirror of Christ, my daily prayer made flesh." The Church called such partnerships edifying, so long as they didn't become excessive. But what was excessive? Who decided? That was where Abbess Leonor's silence became her strategy. Every convent was assigned a confessor, a priest tasked with hearing confessions, offering penance, and reporting transgressions to ecclesiastical authorities. But for nearly 9 years, Santa Clara operated without a permanent confessor. The last one, Father Matteo, resigned due to repeated illness and fatigue. Temporary confessors were brought in, but none stayed long. Some cited unusual liturgical practices. Others referenced non-compliance with full confessional record-keeping. In effect, the abbess assumed informal control over spiritual discipline. She assigned internal penances. She allowed some confessions to be written rather than spoken. She kept the Church at arm's length. This gap in male supervision created a rare pocket of autonomous female governance, one that permitted, or at least did not punish, bonds of affection that might have otherwise been censured. One of the few surviving artifacts from Santa Clara's Peak is a manuscript songbook labeled Cantigas del Silencio, Songs of Silence. It contains 24 hymns, none found in other Franciscan sources. These songs refer to the veil between us and the breath of another on prayer, use imagery from the Song of Songs, especially the lines about lips dripping myrrh and the beloved leaping over mountains, feature harmonies written in pairs, suggesting they were sung in duets, not in choir. No evidence suggests these were performed publicly. Instead, they were private devotions, likely shared between nuns in quiet hours, possibly at dawn or after Compline. One hymn, Osculo Paces, ends with this line: "I send no words, only warmth beneath your door." Were these songs expressions of homoerotic desire? Or were they mystical metaphors? It's impossible to know, but their preservation, and their absence from inquisitorial lists, suggests that either Rome never knew, or Rome chose to see poetry, not sedition. Santa Clara had wealth. It accepted dowries, owned vineyards, and maintained silk weaving rooms. This gave the convent material autonomy, and with it, room for selective interpretation of rules. Some pairs of nuns exchanged braided prayer cords with hidden initials, paintings of saints resembling one another, rings. One inventory from 1491 mentions a circle of silver wire inscribed with initials and a dove. Its value, negligible. Its meaning, unrecorded. But later, in a private letter from a visiting bishop, we find this complaint: "These women have invented sacraments of their own. They call them bonds, not vows. But the heart knows the difference." Even in his rebuke, the bishop recognized the power at work. Unofficial vows, deeply emotional, performed in sacred language and protected by the convent's wealth. At the same time these emotional practices grew within Santa Clara, Rome faced existential threats. The Ottoman Empire loomed. The Protestant Reformation stirred on the horizon. Spain was becoming an arm of imperial Catholicism, conquering the New World. Santa Clara, though unconventional, was quiet. No scandals reached Rome. No heresies were declared. No uprisings occurred. From the outside, it appeared well-run, devout, and productive. Thus, the Vatican, preoccupied with grander battles, saw no reason to intervene. And perhaps, for the women within Santa Clara, this inattention was liberation. If the Church governs by visibility, then is the greatest power not resistance, but discretion? What else might survive when the watcher turns away? Unlike dramatic stories of heresy or scandal in convents elsewhere, Santa Clara did not explode. It faded softly, almost imperceptibly, like breath leaving a warm room. By 1509, a new abbess had taken over. The circle of 6 nuns mentioned in earlier records were no longer listed together in daily duties. One was transferred to a distant convent near Córdoba. Another, Sister Lucia, died in the infirmary. Her death was marked in the convent ledger with a curious note. Her psalter was kept sealed, per her wishes. It was rare to seal a prayer book. That meant there was something inside, not necessarily scandalous, but personal. Something not meant to be passed on. We do not know what was inside Sister Lucia's psalter. It was never opened again. The book was buried with her. By the 1520s, Spain's religious climate had changed. The Counter-Reformation loomed. Orders from Rome demanded greater oversight of female houses, rewriting of rulebooks to exclude excessive personal friendships, regular visits from male clerics, including confessors and bishops. Santa Clara underwent reform visitation in 1523. A bishop's report noted, "The sisters are orderly. The choir sings in unison. There is no reportable deviation from rule." But a separate note, handwritten in the margin, reads, "They pray together but do not speak much. Their glances are too familiar." That line would have been enough to trigger inquiry in another age. But in Santa Clara, it meant little. The Church's focus remained elsewhere, on Luther, on Rome, on empires. The convent endured, but its atmosphere changed. Letters disappeared. Spiritual partnerships were not renewed. The songbook, Cantigas del Silencio, was locked in the archive and not sung again. By the late 1500s, few traces remained of the original women of the circle. Sister Clara, the lyrical writer, died in 1521. Her belongings included a crucifix smoothed by decades of use and a folded page of unknown text, now too faded to read. Sister Beatriz was reassigned, apparently voluntarily, to a rural convent. A later note describes her as serene, but prone to long silences. Abbess Leonor retired before she died, leaving no official memoirs. But in a letter archived under a cardinal's estate, she is quoted saying, "The rules guard the walls. I guarded the hearts." Her tombstone, modest and weather-worn, bore only the inscription, "She kept the peace." In 1922, a local historian researching regional liturgical music opened a locked cabinet in the archive of Santa Clara. Inside were the Cantigas del Silencio manuscript, 2 hair rings labeled with initials no longer on record, a wooden crucifix etched with 3 overlapping circles. There was no explanatory note. No scandal. No warning. The historian included a short paragraph in his paper. It seems this convent fostered a private devotional culture, delicate and emotional, though not improper. It is a theology of touch without touch. The phrase stuck. Today, theology of touch without touch is used by scholars to describe forms of embodied devotion and intimacy practiced within strict religious limits. It has become a lens through which to examine female monastic life, not as oppression alone, but as a site of creativity, restraint, and resilience. You can visit Santa Clara today. It is still a convent, still enclosed, but quieter now, fewer sisters, fewer visitors, no archives open to the public. The chapel holds a plain altar. The choir stalls are carved with initials, likely from the 18th century. The cloister garden is modest. Olive trees, lavender, a stone bench against the wall. There are no statues of Leonore. No plaques for the circle. The nuns buried in the west crypt lie beneath unmarked slabs. And yet, their story breathes between the stones. A slip of melody sometimes hums at vespers. A line from the cantigas found its way into a modern hymnal. A professor at the University of Salamanca is reconstructing the songbook, note by note. And so, the story survives, not in defiance, but in reverent persistence. What Rome ignored was not just the emotion of 6 women, or the leniency of a clever abbess. It ignored the entire spectrum of inner life: longing, discipline, ambiguity, fidelity outside formal vows. By choosing not to see, the Church allowed Santa Clara to become something both obedient and transgressive. It was a cloister, yes, but also a circle of understanding, bound by metaphor and quiet ritual. And perhaps this is the story's strange conclusion: what survives history is not always what is written, but what is remembered through absence. If silence was the language of the cloister, and affection the ink no one dared name, then perhaps what mattered most was not whether Rome looked away, but that these women found each other anyway. The year is 1555. Inside the small, dim chapel of the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila, Spain, a woman lies prostrate on the cold stone floor. Her hands tremble. Her eyes are shut. Her breath comes in irregular gasps. To the sisters nearby, it appears she is having another vision, one of many. They do not interrupt. They know this routine. She will lie still for hours, overcome, transported, unreachable. She will later write of it in her journal. The woman is Teresa Sanchez de Cepeda y Ahumada, better known to us as Saint Teresa of Avila. Her later writings will describe these episodes as encounters with God's overwhelming love, but their language, rich, sensory, flushed with physicality, will raise eyebrows for centuries. In one of her most famous visions, she writes, "I saw an angel beside me. He was beautiful, his face burning with light. In his hand he held a long golden spear. He pierced my heart again and again. The pain was so intense, and yet I felt such sweetness, such delight that I never wished it to end." This is not the description of a theological argument or an intellectual conversion. It is the language of physical ecstasy. But what exactly was Teresa experiencing? And why did the Church accept her sensual mysticism when so many other women were silenced or punished? Born in 1515 to a noble Castilian family, Teresa was intelligent, stubborn, and imaginative. She read romances and chivalric tales as a child and once attempted to run away with her brother to seek martyrdom in the land of the Moors. Her early education was religious but rigid. At 16, after the death of her mother, her father sent her to a convent school. By 20, she had entered the Carmelite order, but her early years in religious life were marked by illness, distraction, and dissatisfaction. She later described this period as half-hearted, a time when her body obeyed, but her soul wandered. She flirted with ideas. She questioned discipline. She longed for something more than rules. It was only after a severe illness left her bedridden for months that her inner life began to change. During these hours of forced stillness, she began to pray deeply, write privately, and experience what she called raptures. When Teresa began to document her experiences, her confessor was wary. But he recognized her literary talent. Her sentences unfolded in waves of sensation, using metaphors of touch, taste, and fire. "The Lord comes upon me like a storm, and I am no longer in this world. He takes hold of my soul as one might cradle a trembling creature. The soul is suspended. It neither breathes nor sees, but it burns." This was not the rational, scholastic theology of male mystic. This was embodied spirituality, full of voluptuous metaphors and descriptions of penetration, surrender, and pleasure. Modern scholars have debated, was Teresa sublimating erotic longing? Was her language a product of her body's deprivation? Or was she using sensual terms to describe something that truly had no physical analogy? We cannot know. But we can say this: Teresa's mysticism did not avoid the body. It started with it. In the medieval church, suffering was often elevated as a pathway to sainthood. But Teresa reversed the current. She described pleasure so intense it became pain, and pain so intimate it became holy. She wrote, "It is a pain so sweet, so delicious, that the soul cannot bear it without weeping." Her descriptions align closely with those found in the Song of Songs, the Bible's most erotic text, long used by mystics to describe spiritual longing. But unlike earlier women who borrowed such language cautiously, Teresa embraced it fully. She even wrote of moments where she begged God not to show himself again, because the sweetness was more than she could bear. Teresa's body was a source of curiosity and confusion, even in her own time. Some contemporaries accused her of hysteria, a common label for women who showed intense emotion. Others suggested her visions were the result of fasting, lack of sleep, or neural illness. And yet, she passed every ecclesiastical investigation. Why? She was always submissive to confessors, even as she questioned their understanding. She never claimed to teach new doctrine, only to describe personal experiences. She positioned her most controversial visions as gifts from God, not products of her own will. Her strategic humility, combined with her powerful prose, protected her. Still, her body remained the site of tension. At her death, she was said to smell of roses, her corpse uncorrupted. These became signs of sainthood. But others whispered, her body had always been suspiciously alive. Over a century later, the Italian sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini would immortalize Teresa's most famous vision in white marble, the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, located in the Cornaro Chapel in Rome. The sculpture shows Teresa collapsed backward, her mouth open, her robe billowing. An angel stands above her, gently lifting a spear, his smile subtle, almost knowing. Art historians have debated the scene endlessly. Is it religious? Erotic? Both? What is certain is that Bernini understood what the Church had tried not to say aloud, that Teresa's mysticism was not cleanly separable from the sensual, that her visions were not pure ideas but felt experiences, grounded in her breathing, trembling, flesh-and-blood body. If Teresa's visions brought her closer to God, but also awakened her body, was it faith that pierced her? Or was it something she had always carried, waiting for a holy excuse to feel it fully? After her intense, early mystical experiences, Teresa of Avila was not content to remain in a cloistered world of visions. In her late 30s and early 40s, she began to imagine something more: reform, autonomy, and a new kind of convent. She described this not just as a political mission, but a divine calling. And yet, the irony was stark. Her spiritual life had exploded into sensual, ecstatic experiences, and now she sought to rein it all in. Her solution was to build her own walls. In 1562, Teresa founded the convent of St. Joseph in Avila, the first of what would become 17 Reformed Carmelite houses. These houses were strictly enclosed, required real poverty, isolated from external interference. Why? Because Teresa believed that God needed silence, simplicity, and space to enter. But also because she knew that intimacy, spiritual or otherwise, was dangerous when unsupervised. It's tempting to see her reforms as reactionary, but they were also deeply feminist. In a medieval way, Teresa created a system where women answered only to women. No priests inside the convent. No meddling bishops unless invited. No confessor could dominate their spiritual journeys. Still, inside these walls, desire did not disappear. It took new forms. In 1577, Teresa wrote her most famous mystical treatise, the interior castle. She described the soul as a 7-roomed palace, with God at the center like a blazing light. The journey, she said, was to move inward, through rooms of self-knowledge, purification, detachment, until one reached union with the divine. But the metaphors she used were not sterile. They were alive with movement, sensation, and love. The Lord enters the soul like water through a sponge. He wounds the soul with arrows of light, until it cannot but surrender. The final mansion is not speech, but silence filled with sweetness. This is not metaphor as theology. This is metaphor as experience, and it's profoundly bodily. In her spiritual universe, the soul is penetrable. God is active, moving through space and flesh. Ecstasy is a holy reaction to divine nearness. Many male mystics spoke of detachment. Teresa spoke of melting. Teresa's disciples, young women from all over Spain, were taught to meditate in silence for long hours fast until their bodies became receptive. Write down visions, if they occurred, but only with supervision. Some of these women, like Ana de Jesus and Maria de San Jose, began experiencing their own raptures. Like their teacher, they wrote of warmth, trembling, and closeness to God that left them exhausted and weeping. And yet, Teresa warned them not to seek these experiences. They come as gifts, she wrote, not prizes. But she also validated them. She did not dismiss visions, dreams, or intense feelings. She framed them within the Carmelite rule, creating a safe channel for what otherwise would have been deemed dangerous hysteria. In effect, Teresa created a theological structure for holy sensuality, carefully couched in orthodoxy, but unmistakably emotional and embodied. Teresa taught her nuns how to sit, how to breathe, how to pray, not just in thought, but in posture. She emphasized, kneeling with the spine straight, eyes half closed, but not fixed on any image. Stillness, except when tears or joy overtook the body. This was not about performance. It was about training the body to become a container for God's presence. In her notebooks, she describes episodes where her feet lifted off the ground. Though she tried to resist it, her heart raced and sweat poured from her hands. Her entire body became heat, and only after the vision ended could she move again. To modern ears, this sounds physiological, even erotic. To Teresa, it was divine intimacy without sin, a moment when the Creator touched the created in a way words could not hold. For much of her life, Teresa's visions were viewed with suspicion. She was investigated by the Inquisition. Her early confessor warned she might be deceived by demons. Some bishops questioned the unladylike heat of her prose. And yet, Rome did not condemn her. Why? Because she never disobeyed directly. She always submitted her writings to male reviewers. Her reforms were successful, her convents flourished. Her mysticism inspired obedience, not rebellion. And perhaps because her visions were so deeply private, they posed no public threat. When she died in 1582, Teresa left behind over 1,000 letters, dozens of mystical works, a powerful model for how a woman could be holy, expressive, and authoritative. In 1614, she was beatified. In 1622, canonized. And in 1970, she became the first woman named Doctor of the Church. Teresa's letters are among the most personal documents of the early modern Church. In them, she is witty, sarcastic, affectionate, occasionally rebellious. To one fellow nun, she wrote, "If I could see your eyes as I wrote this, I believe I would forget the line." Was this flirtation? No. But it was intimacy, deeply felt and honestly expressed, a continuation of her spiritual body into the written word. Her letters have since been sanitized by translators, but the originals still pulse with life. If Teresa surrendered herself completely to divine love, but experienced it in terms of trembling, touch, and longing, was her mysticism a triumph of spirit? Or proof that the body, no matter how hidden, always claims its share of God? It was October 4, 1582. Teresa of Avila died in the small town of Alba de Tormes, surrounded by her nuns. Her body, frail from decades of fasting, writing, and ecstatic prayer, finally gave way. But her death, like her life, would not pass unnoticed. Witnesses recorded a soft fragrance in the room. Her skin remained supple. Her face looked peaceful. Then came the letters, then the relics, then the confusion of the calendar. She died during the night of the shift from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar. Did she die on October 4th or October 15th? The ambiguity, as always, suited her. In the years following her death, a strange new ritual emerged. Nuns would press their faces to her old manuscripts, breathe in her scent, touch her worn shoes. Her body had passed, but something in her still felt alive. She had left behind not just theology, but a template for how to feel God with every nerve. Within weeks of her burial, pilgrims came. Within months, church officials arrived. Her body was exhumed, examined, touched. And then, it was divided. Her heart was removed and displayed in a glass reliquary. Her hand was sent to a Carmelite house in Lisbon. A finger went to Rome. Her arm ended up in Ronda, and would later, bizarrely, be owned briefly by Francisco Franco, who kept it beside his bed. Each piece was said to radiate warmth or fragrance. Her heart bore a scar, which believers claimed was the literal wound from her angelic vision. Thus, Teresa's flesh, once the site of suspicion, ecstasy, and intense scrutiny, became a symbol of holiness, precisely because it had trembled. The Church had once feared her body's vivid metaphors. Now it enshrined her actual nerves and skin. By the 18th century, Teresa's image had softened. Her mystical heat was rebranded as feminine piety. Her raptures became sweet inspirations. Painful ecstasy became spiritual grace. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, feminist theologians and mystic scholars began to return to her original texts, in Spanish, unsanitized. They found physical descriptions previously downplayed, erotic metaphors restored a bold voice, not submissive, but commanding in its humility, and they began to ask, was Teresa writing against the language of her time, using metaphor as a weapon? Was her mysticism a holy camouflage for self-ownership? Was her physicality not just spiritual, but a claim to autonomy in a world that denied female authority? In this view, Teresa becomes not just a saint, but a radical, one who understood how to bend the rules without breaking them, how to write about touch without ever touching. Today, in Carmelite convents around the world, Teresa's writings are still read, often aloud, slowly, as part of formation. Young novices learn to pray her interior castle, to journal their thoughts, and to explore their inner rooms. But they are also warned, gently, that raptures are rare, and visions are not to be sought. Still, the desire lingers. One nun, writing anonymously in the 1990s, noted, "Sometimes when I close my eyes in prayer, I feel her there, like heat behind my ribs. She reminds me that God is not cold." This is Teresa's true legacy. Not sainthood, not doctor of the Church, not relics in glass, but permission. Permission to feel, to tremble, to write desire in divine language. Over time, the Catholic Church came to love Teresa, but never quite understood her. She was canonized in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV, the same year as Saint Ignatius Loyola, ironically, the founder of the Jesuits, a male order known for intellectual rigor, not emotional vision. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her Doctor of the Church, the first woman to receive the title. In doing so, he praised her penetrating intelligence and practical holiness. He did not mention the trembling, the pierced heart, the gasping prayers. And perhaps that was wise. But it was also incomplete. Teresa was not just intellect or obedient. She was wound and will, vulnerability and vision, sweat and script. One of Teresa's last entries, in a small prayer journal, reads, "Let me not fear what you do to me, Lord. For every tremble I offer you is the door you enter through." That sentence, half surrender, half daring, captures her completely. If Teresa's body was feared, dissected, and then enshrined, what does that say about the Church's longing to both control and contain female experience? And if her raptures were suspect, but her obedience made them holy, was her sanctity in her fire, or in how she never let it burn the house down? In the cool hush of an autumn morning, the sisters of the Abbey of Port Royal gathered in silence for lauds. Cloaked in black habits, they moved like shadows across the cloister walk. One nun was missing. She would not return. Her name was Sister Louise de Saint Victoire, and her disappearance would ripple through ecclesiastical courts, family estates, and salacious Parisian salons. But her story, like so many cloistered lives, began quietly, with a name, a dowry, and a locked door. Louise was 17 when she took her first vows. She came from minor provincial nobility. Her family's money was dwindling, and a marriageable daughter was a liability. The convent promised salvation and stability, for them, at least. For Louise it promised something else: boredom, silence, and submission. She tried. She followed the rules. She prayed. She copied the Psalms. But behind the grill, the world outside pulsed, and she could still remember it. Historians discovered them decades later. A small packet of letters, hidden behind a false panel in an old chapel cabinet. Addressed to a man named Philippe de la Roche, they were never sent. The first was cautious. I have not seen your face in 3 winters, but I imagine it when I close my eyes during prayer. The others do not speak of the world. I dream of it nightly. The second bolder. If I were to find the gate unlocked, would you still remember the path to my name? The last was scribbled in haste, stained with wax. By the time this reaches you, I will be gone. There is no record that Philippe replied. But someone must have helped her, because Louise did leave. Convents were not fortresses, but they were designed to keep women in and the world out. Still, there were vulnerabilities. Servants and lay sisters came and went with food and supplies. Confessors and visiting clergy had access to private areas. Laundry was taken out to city washhouses. Louise likely escaped during laundry duty, an hour when novices were allowed into the outer court with chaperones. One chaperone turned away. One foot crossed the threshold. She was wearing her habit. She had no shoes. But she had a plan. From there, she walked east to Paris. Some accounts say she was picked up by a coachman. Others suggest she was already in contact with a man waiting for her. What matters is this: she was gone, and the abbey had to answer. Her family was mortified. Not just because of the scandal, but because her dowry had been paid. To retrieve it, they would have to accuse the convent of negligence. But if they did that, they would also be publicly associated with a runaway nun. The abbess issued a statement. The sister in question had exhibited signs of instability and spiritual confusion. She will be prayed for. The church considered excommunication. The bishop opened a formal inquiry. But there was a problem. Louise was not under final vows. She had taken temporary ones. Legally, she could still change her mind, if she had not yet professed for life. That detail protected her. Just barely. When you imagine a night after battle, the picture that likely comes to mind is cinematic. A steel-clad warrior, bloodied but noble, lifting his visor as the dawn breaks, the field behind him littered with fallen enemies. But the truth, as always, is far less glorious and far more ordinary, boring, in fact, though no less human. The reality of dawn after combat was not triumph but routine, and the first concern was not celebration but washing away the filth of the night before. You see, battle was rarely a clean matter. The armor that knights wore, mail hauberks or later full plate, collected sweat, grime, and the occasional dark stain of blood. Beneath it, the padded gambeson was soaked through. The body under that padding was bruised, scratched, and stinking. What history does not often linger on is the sheer smell of it all. The sourness of sweat, the iron tang of blood, the animal stench of horses, and the smoke of burned-out torches. When the first rays of sun lit the camp, the knights who had survived turned not to glory, but to basins of water, streams, or makeshift tubs. Water was a precious resource. In some campaigns, fresh water was hard to come by, so washing was as much about scraping filth as it was about genuine cleansing. A squire would bring a bucket, often collected from a river, and a cloth would be dipped, wrung out, and then passed over skin and steel. No soaps in the modern sense, just rough cloth, sometimes sand or ash if you were lucky, to scrub away the clinging muck. To be a knight at dawn was to know the scratch of grit on your skin as your servant tried to wipe you clean. The rituals varied. In wealthier courts or on campaigns near towns, knights might be offered heated water, poured into wooden basins. Here, a knight could remove his armor piece by piece, his squire loosening straps stiff with dried blood, until he stood in his linen undershirt, damp and clinging to his skin. He would dip his hands, splash his face, and perhaps wash his feet, the feet being among the most abused parts of the body, blistered and raw from long marches and hours standing in stirrups. This act, mundane and repetitive, was also deeply symbolic. To wash after battle was not merely to clean the body, but to mark the transition from the chaos of combat back into the ordinary routines of camp life. Consider how long it took. Removing armor was not quick. A man could not do it alone. The arming and disarming of a knight required a squire or two, sometimes more, depending on the weight and complexity of the harness. The straps cut into skin, leaving red welts, and after a battle they were stiffened with sweat and grime. A knight might stand, half naked and shivering in the morning air, while his squires pulled at buckles, scraped mud from greaves, and shook out padded garments heavy with damp. The water itself was often reused. A basin might serve several men before it was thrown out, and this meant the act of washing was not a gleaming purification but a negotiation with filth. One knight's blood might wash into another's cloth, the dirty water a collective testimony of the previous day's violence. It was, in every sense, unromantic. And yet, for those men, it was essential. You could not eat, you could not pray, you could not present yourself to your commander, without first attempting to wash away the obvious stains of combat. There was also ritual in the order. Hands, face, then arms. For those devout in their faith, a quick sign of the cross followed. Some knights spoke prayers of thanksgiving, thanking God for their survival before rinsing their mouths or cleaning their eyes. Others remained silent, muttering curses at their wounds or at the cold of the water. For many, this daily act became an anchor. No matter how bloody or chaotic the day before had been, the morning would always begin with water, with the steady hands of a squire wiping down steel, with the sting of cold cloth against bruised skin. It is worth remembering how slow time passed in these moments. We imagine battle as a single, decisive clash, but in truth it was only one episode in the long slog of a campaign. Between battles were endless mornings, and endless mornings meant endless washings. The monotony was itself a form of survival. To do the same small thing every day, to wash your face even when your body ached and your wounds throbbed, was a way of telling yourself that life went on. Now picture the sensory details. The sound of buckles clinking, the slap of wet cloth, the groan of a man as a sore muscle was pressed. The smell of iron and salt in the air. The sight of pale skin streaked with dirt, of water turning brown in a wooden bowl. It was not glorious, but it was grounding. Knights were not immune to the needs of the body, and perhaps it is here, in these small rituals, that they felt most human. And yet, for all this routine, there was something deeply unsettling about the washings. You could scrub the skin, but you could not scrub away the memory of what you had done. Blood washed from armor, but the smell of it seemed to linger in the nose. Hands were wiped clean, but they still remembered the feel of a sword's hilt, slick in the grip. This quiet contradiction, between the physical act of cleansing and the mental stain that remained, was perhaps the truest dawn ritual of all. So as you imagine a night at dawn, do not picture banners flapping heroically in the morning wind. Picture instead a man half stripped of his armor, standing with his squire beside a bucket, wincing as cold water splashes his face, sighing as dirt runs down his arms. Picture him silent, reflecting not on victory but on survival. Washing, always washing, as if the water might carry away not just the sweat and blood but the memory of what came before. But what of the wounds that water could not heal? What of the scratches that turned to festering sores, the bruises that deepened, the infections that no cloth could wipe away? If washing was the first step in recovery, what happened when the water was not enough? If the morning ritual of washing was meant to restore order after the chaos of battle, it also revealed the quiet truth of medieval warfare. No one emerged unscathed. You could wash the dirt from your skin, but beneath it, beneath the armor, beneath the padded gambeson, were bruises that would darken, cuts that would swell, and wounds that water could not cleanse. To understand the dawn rituals of a knight, you must look not just at the basins and cloths but at the bodies they touched, battered and quietly breaking down. A knight's armor was protective, yes, but it was not impenetrable. Even the best steel could not stop the blunt trauma of a mace or the crushing weight of a lance. The gambeson, that quilted undergarment of thick layers of linen stuffed with horsehair or wool, absorbed much, but it also trapped sweat and grime. When a knight removed it in the morning, his body was revealed. Purple bruises across ribs, welts along the shoulders, red cuts across thighs and arms. Washing these areas was not a gentle act. Cold water stung, cloth rubbed raw skin until it bled again. The squire's hand, meant to cleanse, often reopened wounds. And here lies the quiet horror of dawn in a knight's camp: infection. Medieval men knew nothing of bacteria. To them, wounds were punished flesh, injuries to be endured or prayed over. But for us, looking back, we see how deadly the simplest scratch could be. A shallow cut along the hand, left unwashed or rubbed with dirty cloth, could swell within days, turning red and hot, spreading fever through the body. What began as a minor inconvenience in the dawn washing ritual could be the seed of death before the next sunrise. Some attempted remedies. Ash was sometimes rubbed into wounds, not because they understood its antiseptic qualities, but because it was abrasive and could clean away grime. Vinegar, when available, was poured on cuts. Wine, too, was used, though more often as a luxury than a medical tool. Honey had its place in older traditions, though rarely in the battlefield camp. And herbs, plantain, yarrow, comfrey, were gathered by those with knowledge, smeared onto gashes, bound with linen strips. Still, the effectiveness was limited, and the knight knew it. Every time he bent over a basin of water, every time his squire wrung out the cloth, there was the quiet question: would this wound heal or would it rot? For the knight, the act of washing was also a moment of confrontation with his own mortality. He could hide behind armor in battle, shielded by steel, but in the silence of morning he faced himself. To lift the cloth and see a bruise spreading down his side, to dab at a wound that oozed pus, these were reminders that he was not invincible. And yet, he continued the ritual day after day, as if habit could defy reality. Religion gave shape to the ritual as well. Knights were, after all, not only warriors but Christian warriors, bound by vows of service and piety. Morning prayers often followed the washings. A knight might trace the sign of the cross in the dirty water before drying his hands. He might murmur a psalm, thanking God for sparing him while his companions lay dead in the field. Sometimes, priests or chaplains moved among the men, offering blessings, reminding them that wounds of the flesh were less important than the purity of the soul. And yet, when infection spread, when fever gripped a man, these prayers were often the only medicine he received. It is easy to forget how much of a knight's survival depended not on his own strength, but on the invisible work of others. Squires, pages, camp followers, these were the hands that fetched water, scrubbed armor, boiled cloths, and sometimes tended wounds with what little knowledge they had. A knight alone could not wash himself properly. His armor was too heavy, his straps too complicated, his injuries too awkward to reach. The washing ritual was, therefore, a shared act. A knight's dignity might demand silence, but the reality was intimate. Another man's hands bathing him, wrapping his wounds, cleaning his body where he could not. And yet, there were limits to what they could do. The dawn ritual, for all its monotony, could not protect against disease. Imagine the camp after a long campaign. Dozens of men sharing basins, reusing cloths, washing in rivers fouled with waste. The very act meant to restore might instead spread illness. Dysentery, fevers, skin infections, all lingered in the background, waiting. Washing, then, was as much about the appearance of cleanliness as its reality. To look clean, to appear ready for the day's duties, was often more important than the unseen microbes left behind. There is a peculiar dignity in this persistence. Even as wounds festered, even as men limped or coughed, the washing continued. Not because it always worked, but because it was expected. To be a knight was to maintain the forms, armor polished, face wiped, body prepared. Survival was uncertain, but ritual was constant. And so the morning ritual became more than hygiene. It became a symbol of order imposed on chaos. The previous day might have been soaked in violence, but the morning brought a pattern: water, cloth, armor, prayer. By repeating these actions, knights told themselves that life went on, that tomorrow would look like today, that the endless wheel of campaign life continued to turn. But beneath the repetition lurked unease. How many wounds could a body endure before it gave out? How many washings could disguise the truth of decay? And how long could ritual hold back the weight of reality? By now you can see that washing after battle was never merely about dirt and sweat. It was a ritual, yes, but one layered with meaning, physical necessity, spiritual symbolism, and the fragile attempt to impose order upon a world defined by chaos. In this final part, we must ask what this ritual truly represented in the life of a knight, and why, despite its monotony, it mattered. At its most basic level, the ritual was about survival. A body that was never washed, never tended, became a breeding ground for rot. Knights may not have known about bacteria, but they knew enough to fear filth. Chronic sores, foul smells, infected wounds, all these weakened a warrior. And in a world where reputation mattered as much as strength, the battlefield, to wash, to clean your armor, to make yourself presentable, these were not luxuries. They were essential to maintaining the image of knightly dignity. Armor itself was a kind of second skin, and its care required constant attention. After washing the body, squires turned to the steel. Cloths rubbed away rust, oil was applied in thin coats, leather straps were checked, and dents hammered back into shape. This too was part of the dawn ritual. To neglect it was unthinkable. Rust spread quickly, leather cracked, and once a harness was compromised, it might fail in battle. Washing the body and washing the armor were inseparable acts, two halves of a single morning discipline. But beyond the physical, there was the weight of faith. For medieval knights, washing often held echoes of baptism, a daily miniature version of cleansing the soul. Some historians suggest that the ritual itself was imbued with a kind of sacramental undertone, though performed without liturgy. Water, after all, was the universal purifier. To wash the face was to symbolically begin again, to cast away the sins of yesterday's violence. A knight might kneel by the basin, splash water over his head, and feel for a moment that he had been made new. The irony, of course, was that no water could cleanse the guilt of killing. Still, the ritual offered a kind of reprieve, a small mercy in a brutal life. The act also carried psychological weight. Imagine the mind of a knight, haunted by the cries of men cut down, the sights of torn bodies, the smell of blood that clung even after washing. The morning ritual, repetitive and familiar, provided stability. Psychologists today might call it a coping mechanism. Each morning, the same pattern: remove armor, wash, pray, eat. It gave shape to time, anchored the night in routine, and dulled the sharper edges of memory. You could not erase what had happened, but you could at least tell yourself that the world was still orderly, still predictable. And yet, there was always the unspoken truth: washing had limit. Some wounds did not heal. Some fevers did not break. Some memories did not fade. The morning ritual could soothe, but it could not save. And perhaps that was why it mattered so much, because in its very futility, it became an act of defiance. To wash was to say, I am still here. I survived another night. I will face another day. We often imagine knights only as warriors, but here we glimpse them as men. Men who winced at cold water, who groaned as squires peeled off damp gambesons, who muttered prayers under their breath. Men who feared infection more than the sword, who dreaded the slow wasting of disease more than the quick death of combat. Men who sought, in water and cloth, a small piece of comfort in a world that offered so little. By the time a knight was fully washed, dressed, and armed again, the ritual had done its work. The body was at least cleaner, the armor polished, the face wiped free of dirt. Outwardly, he was ready once more, ready for drills, ready for council, ready for whatever the day demanded. Inwardly, perhaps, the ritual gave him a fragile sense of renewal, however brief. History does not often record these moments. Chronicles tell us of battles, kings, treaties, and victories. Rarely do they tell us of basins of water at dawn, of squires wringing out cloths, of bruised men wincing as they scrubbed away filth. And yet, without these small, boring rituals, knights would not have endured. Their armor would have rusted, their bodies weakened, their morale collapsed. The glory of chivalry was built, in no small part, upon the tedious act of washing at dawn. And so, when you imagine knights of old, do not see only the tournaments and the charges across fields. See also the quiet mornings, when victory was measured not by banners but by the simple act of rising, of washing, of preparing to live one more day. But ask yourself this: if washing after battle offered comfort to the body and ritual for the mind, what of the soul? Could water alone ever cleanse the weight of killing, the memories of screams, the faces of the fallen? Or were these things that no ritual, however repeated, could ever truly wash away? If washing was the first ritual of dawn, eating was the second, and it was often more urgent. For a knight, survival after battle was not secured by victory alone, but by the quiet act of breaking bread the next morning. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, and the first meal after combat was rarely a feast. It was, instead, a negotiation between what the body craved and what the camp could provide. Imagine the battlefield at dusk, the air still heavy with the smell of blood and smoke. Through the night, knights slept fitfully, if they slept at all. The body, drained by hours of fighting, was stiff and sore. By morning, stomachs ached with emptiness. Bread, hard and stale from travel. Cheese, if it had survived the march without spoiling. Ale, often safer to drink than water. These were the staples of the knight's first meal after battle. Romantic as medieval banquets sound, the reality for most warriors was dry crusts chewed with aching jaws and gulps of bitter liquid to soften the bite. The bread itself tells a story. Baked days earlier, carried in sacks or supplied by local villages, it hardened quickly. To soften it, knights or squires dunked it into ale or broth if any meat had been boiled from bones. Cheese, usually hard and salted, was gnawed in chunks. Meat was rarer unless the army had plundered livestock. And if meat appeared, it was tough, stringy, and boiled rather than roasted, a practical choice to stretch small amounts further. To eat was not to enjoy but to endure, to quiet the stomach long enough to face the day's march or next skirmish. Ale was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Water in camps was often unsafe, fouled by waste or blood. Ale, brewed with fermentation, was less likely to carry disease. It was weak by modern standards, more nourishment than intoxication, but it dulled the edge of hunger. For knights, it was as constant as bread. The first gulp in the morning was bitter, sometimes sour, but it was safer than dipping a cup into the nearest stream. Now imagine the setting of this meal. Not a hall with banners but a patch of ground by the camp. Knights sat with squires, sometimes with common soldiers, the hierarchy softened by exhaustion. Crusts were broken and passed. A knight might lean on his sword as he chewed, grimacing at a tooth jarred loose in combat. A squire might boil a pot of oats, if there were supplies, stirring it with a wooden spoon blackened from many fires. The smell was humble grain, smoke, sweat, but for those who survived the night, it was the smell of life continuing. The act of eating carried its own dangers. Mouths were raw from shouting, lips split from dehydration, teeth cracked by blows. To chew was sometimes painful. To swallow bread with a throat still dry from battle cries was agony. And yet they ate because they had to. Hunger was relentless, and a man who did not eat could not fight. This first meal was also a reckoning. As men gathered to eat, absences became visible. The places where companions should have sat were empty. The bread rationed for them was left untouched. A knight might glance around, chew silently, and realize that the man who fought beside him yesterday would never eat again. In this way, the first meal after battle was as much about grief as it was about sustenance. Food also revealed hierarchy. Commanders often had better supplies, preserved meats, sweeter wine, softer bread. Common knights and their squires ate the rougher fare. Still, hunger was a great leveler. At dawn, with stomachs growling, even the proudest knight gnawed at crusts softened in ale. Survival did not care for titles. For some, eating became ritualized with prayer. Before bread was broken, a short blessing was spoken, thanking God for sustenance. For others, silence dominated. The sounds of chewing and the occasional cough filled the camp. It was a communal act, but not always a convivial one. The weight of death lingered too heavily for laughter. And yet, in its ordinariness, the first meal after battle was profound. Victory might mean little if the stomach remained empty. The glory of combat faded quickly in the face of gnawing hunger. Bread and ale, humble as they were, became the true reward of survival. They were the reminder that life went on, that the body demanded attention even when the mind was haunted. But there is an irony in this. The meal that sustained knights also reminded them of their fragility. A man could swing a sword with all his might one day and be brought low by spoiled meat or foul water the next. Hunger was an enemy as persistent as any foe on the battlefield. So, as you picture knights breaking bread in the morning light, do not imagine merriment or feasting. Imagine weary men hunched over crusts, dipping them in ale, chewing slowly, sometimes wincing with pain. Picture the quiet silence of a camp where death had just passed, where every bite was both necessity and remembrance. And ask yourself this: if survival depended as much on bread and ale as on sword and shield, then who truly won the battles of the Middle Ages, the knights themselves or the bakers and brewers who kept them alive? The first bites of bread and gulps of ale satisfied the body's urgency, but once the edge of hunger was dulled, the larger question arose: what did eating mean after battle? For knights, meals were never simply about nourishment. They were statements of class, of faith, of survival, and the way food was eaten in those fragile hours after combat revealed more about medieval life than the clash of swords ever could. Knights were not peasants, though their diets often resembled one another in campaign life. In the castles and halls of peacetime, knights dined on roasted meats, spiced stews, and fine loaves baked from wheat rather than barley. But on the road, in a campaign camp, that distinction collapsed. Victory or defeat made little difference. The food at dawn was rough, often indistinguishable from what the common soldier ate. This was a humbling reality of war. A man of noble lineage, who at home might not touch coarse bread, now softened stale crusts in weak ale just as his squire did. Still, hierarchy asserted itself in subtle ways. Commanders and wealthier knights might secure better rations from nearby villages or from the spoils of battle. Chickens roasted over spits appeared in the tents of leaders, while ordinary men gnawed hard cheese and onion. Wine, more precious than ale, was reserved for those of status. Yet even these luxuries often carried the taste of necessity: meat undercooked, wine soured from travel, bread already hardening. Glory did not season the food. The circumstances of campaign life did. The act of eating itself was laced with ritual. To break bread was not only to feed the body but to remind men of their faith. Knights were, after all, Christian warriors, and meals were often opened with prayers. The Lord's Prayer was common, as was a psalm of thanksgiving for deliverance. In some camps, chaplains blessed the bread and ale before distribution. To eat without acknowledgement of God's mercy was frowned upon, particularly after the slaughter of battle. The ritual gave the meal a double meaning. It was both sustenance and sacrament, a way of linking physical nourishment with spiritual gratitude. But faith was not the only weight at the table. There was grief, and it was heavy. Meals were the moments when absences were most visible. Bread was rationed with the expectation of numbers, and when a man had fallen, his portion sat unused. Squires carried food for masters who no longer rose. Friends sat with empty space beside them, the silence more profound than words. In these moments, the act of eating became an acknowledgement of death. To chew was to carry on. To swallow was to admit that survival meant moving forward without those who had not. Ale played its own role in this balance. Weak though it was, it dulled edges, not only of hunger but of thought. A knight might drink deeply not just to wash down bread but to quiet his mind. The bitterness of the brew, the heaviness in the stomach, gave a kind of blunt comfort. The first meal after battle was often silent, but the second, after more ale, might loosen tongues. Stories of the fight were told, men laughed at narrow escapes, companions remembered the fallen. In this way, ale served both as nourishment and as the thin veil between sorrow and endurance. Eating also revealed the practical realities of campaign life. Bones were kept, boiled again and again for broth until nothing remained. Nothing was wasted. Onion skins flavored pots, crusts thickened stews, even animal fat was collected for later use. To eat after battle was not only to recover but to plan. Food was survival currency, and the knight knew that each bite eaten now meant one less for tomorrow. Victory might bring plunder, but just as often it brought scarcity, burned fields, looted villages, supply wagons lost in the chaos. It is striking how often chroniclers skipped over these details. They wrote of kings and conquests but rarely of what the victors ate. Yet here, in the shadows of battle, food told the deeper story. Bread and ale were the true reward of survival. They were not glamorous, but they were grounding. Without them, no knight could swing his sword again. The first meal after battle was therefore more than just the filling of stomach. It was a mirror of the medieval world, a place where hierarchy and faith, grief and survival, luxury and scarcity, all sat together in the silence of dawn. But if bread and ale sustained the living, what happened when there was none to be had? What happened when battle destroyed the very fields that might have fed the victors? When we think of knights eating after battle, our minds often leap to banquets, long tables laden with roasted meats, golden cups brimming with wine, and laughter echoing through candlelit halls. But for most warriors, the reality was far removed from these images. If a banquet appeared, it was rare, fleeting, and usually reserved for the highest in command. For the rest, eating after battle meant facing a paradox. Victory could fill the soul, but it did not always fill the stomach. In some campaigns, commanders staged feasts after major victories. Livestock taken from villages was slaughtered, fires were lit, and wine casks cracked open. These were more than meals, they were statements of power. To eat richly after battle was to show that the army was not weakened, that supplies were plentiful, that the victors were secure enough to celebrate. The clatter of knives on trenchers, the fat dripping from roasting spits, the smell of meat carried on the wind, these signaled not just nourishment but dominance. For knights, being invited to such a table was an honor, a mark of standing. Yet these moments were exceptions, not the rule. More often, meals after battle were marked by scarcity. Armies moved through countryside that had been stripped bare, either by the enemy or by their own foraging. Villages fled at the sound of hoofbeats, carrying what they could. Grain stores were hidden, animals driven off, wells fouled. In such places, Even victorious knights might find themselves chewing the same stale bread as before, the only difference being that their hunger was sharper, their bodies more drained. This contrast, between the ideal of the feast and the reality of hunger, was central to the knightly experience. Chronicles spoke of grand banquets because they symbolized triumph, but silence often covered the ordinary days when food was scarce. Yet for the knight, it was the scarcity that defined survival. He could endure wounds, endure marches, endure fear, but without food, the body collapsed. Meals after battle also reflected the fragile web of logistics that held medieval armies together. Supply wagons creaked behind the lines, carrying sacks of grain, barrels of ale, wheels of cheese. When these wagons arrived, the camp ate. When they did not, men starved. Foraging was dangerous, often sparking skirmishes with locals or ambushes by enemy scouts. Knights depended on peasants, those very people they often scorned, for their survival. Without bread baked by village ovens, without ale brewed in small huts, their victories would have been short-lived. And then there was the personal dimension. Eating after battle was not only about the army but about the body. Knights who suffered broken teeth, bruised jaws, or split lips struggled even to chew. Meat might be beyond them. Broth and softened bread were all they could manage. The phrase "broken bones" was no metaphor. Combat left real injuries that turned every meal into a quiet struggle. In this sense, food became a test of endurance just as much as the battlefield had been. Psychologically, the act of eating after combat carried another burden: the weight of memory. Each bite of bread reminded a knight of the absent faces. The man who had shared a crust yesterday might be gone today. The place at the fire, once crowded, might sit empty. Food became both comfort and reminder, filling the stomach while deepening the ache of loss. To eat was to acknowledge survival, but also to admit that survival was unevenly distributed. Still, nights were not without moments of simple joy. Even stale bread, softened in warm broth, could feel like a blessing after days of hunger. A roasted chicken, rare as it was, might seem like a feast. And in those moments, laughter sometimes returned. Stories were told, boasting began, the edge of fear dulled by full stomachs. The paradox of food after battle was that it was both grim necessity and fragile celebration, a way of affirming life even in the shadow of death. We remember the knights for their swords, but their survival depended just as much on bread and ale. Without the quiet ritual of the first meal, no battle could be fought the next day, no campaign could continue. The body demanded what glory could not give. And so, when you picture knights after combat, do not see only the shining banquets of legend. See also the broken crusts, the bitter ale, the men chewing slowly with swollen jaws. See the silence of absent companions, the relief of a mouthful of broth, the irony of victors who sometimes starved in their own camps. Because the truth is this: victory filled the chronicles, but bread filled the belly. And in the end, which one mattered more? When the noise of battle faded, the field fell strangely silent. What remained were groans, whispers, and the sound of footsteps carrying the wounded back to camp. If you were a knight, this was when the true endurance began, not on the battlefield, but in the tent, where wounds were tended in the dim light of torches and oil lamps. Here, there were no cheers of victory, no clashing swords, no glory. Only pain, patience, and the quiet labor of hands trying to keep you alive. The first hours after combat were critical. Knights, stripped of armor and washed as best they could, were examined by squires, fellow soldiers, or, if fortunate, a camp physician. Yet physician was a loose term. Many were barber surgeons, trained not in modern medicine but in the crude arts of cutting, bleeding, and bandaging. Their tools were simple: knives, needles, bone saws, cauterizing irons. Their knowledge was rooted in Galen's humors, the belief that illness stemmed from imbalances of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And so, treatment often meant letting blood, applying leeches, or balancing diets as much as closing wounds. In the tent, however, pragmatism ruled. A knight bleeding from a deep cut in the arm did not need philosophy. He needed the bleeding stopped. The methods were direct, if brutal. Pressure applied with cloth. Bandages wrapped tightly. If the wound gaped, it might be stitched shut with rough thread, the needle heated in fire. If bleeding refused to stop, cauterization followed, iron rods heated until they glowed red, pressed into flesh to seal vessels. The smell of burning skin was common in the healing tents, and it mixed with the scent of sweat, blood, and herbs. Pain was constant. There was no anesthesia. Ale or wine dulled the senses, sometimes opium if a supply existed, but most nights endured the knife fully awake. The sound of groaning filled the tents, sometimes interrupted by screams. Survival required endurance, and in this space, bravery was measured not by a charge on horseback, but by one's ability to grit teeth while a surgeon stitched a wound shut. Not every wound could be closed. Some were too deep, too infected, or too mangled. Amputation became the grim solution. Though rare for knights compared to common soldiers, since losing a limb often meant losing status, it still occurred. A crushed hand, a festering leg, a wound that would not heal. The barber surgeon's saw was quick, but the risk of death from infection afterward was enormous. For every knight who survived the saw, many more perished in the days to come, feverish and delirious. But treatment was not only physical. Herbal poultices were common, made from plants gathered near the camp. Yarrow was used to stop bleeding, plantain to soothe cuts, comfort to knit broken bones. Garlic and honey, sometimes combined, were applied to wounds, though without understanding why, knights occasionally benefited from their natural antibacterial properties. Linen bandages, boiled if the camp had firewood and thyme, wrapped injuries. These small gestures of care, repeated again and again, were the difference between life and death. Silence filled the tents not because there was no suffering, but because suffering became ordinary. Groans were expected, the sight of blood normal. Companions sat with one another, sometimes holding hands, sometimes whispering prayers. Priests moved quietly through the rows, offering last rites to those beyond saving. The boundary between healing and dying was thin, and often only time decided which side a knight would fall on. For squires, the work was relentless. They held their masters steady during stitching. They cleaned wounds with cold water, emptied basins dark with blood, fetched herbs, and kept fires burning for cauterization. Their loyalty was measured not only in the heat of battle but in the dim hours after, when they tended to bruised ribs, swollen limbs, and fevers that would not break. The bond forged in those moments was one of quiet intimacy, closer, perhaps, than any bond formed in combat. The tents were also places of negotiation between faith and medicine. A knight might whisper a prayer as his wound was stitched, asking for divine mercy. A priest might sprinkle holy water over the injured. Relics were sometimes placed near the bed, as if proximity to sacred objects could speed healing. And yet, alongside these acts of faith, the surgeon's knife still cut, the bandage still tightened, the iron still pressed. It was never one or the other, it was both. Faith gave hope. Crude medicine gave the chance of survival. It is worth imagining the sounds. The quiet sobbing of squires, the whispered prayers of chaplains, the rasp of cloth tearing into strips, the hiss of irons in fire, the sudden scream as hot metal met flesh. These were the true sounds of the medieval battlefield's aftermath, not horns or trumpets, but the raw, human noises of suffering and survival. And yet, despite the horror, life in the tents continued. Wounds were bound, fevers monitored, broken bones set with splints. Knights who survived these first hours often carried scars for life. Arms stiffened, legs limped, eyes clouded. The tent did not return men to glory, it returned them, if they were fortunate to function. But here lies the question. How many knights endured these crude healings only to fall later, their wounds festering despite all efforts? And how many survived not because of skill or faith, but by sheer chance? If the first hours after battle determined immediate survival, the following days tested endurance. The tents grew quieter, but not calmer. Wounded knights lay on straw pallets or wooden cots, their bodies wrapped in linen, their fates uncertain. In these hours, medicine gave way to time, and time was not always merciful. Recovery in a medieval camp was rarely straightforward. The body might rally after treatment, but fever lurked in every wound. Infection was a silent enemy, advancing slowly, often unseen until it was too late. A knight who seemed well one morning could shiver with chills by evening, sweat soaking his gambeson and blankets. His squire, frantic, would wring out cloths to cool him, whispering prayers, waiting to see whether his master's body would break the fever or be consumed by it. Food became part of the treatment. Weak broths were given to the wounded, their bellies unable to handle hard bread or tough meat. If a knight could eat, it was seen as a hopeful sign. If he refused food, muttering through cracked lips or pushing away a spoon, his chances dwindled. Ale, once daily sustenance, now doubled as medicine, used to clean wounds, soothe the throat, or dull the mind enough for sleep. Herbs continued their work in these days. Poultices were replaced, bandages changed. Comfrey leaves were pressed against fractures, honey smeared over festering cuts, onion poultices laid upon swelling. Garlic, crushed into paste, was stuffed into wounds by those who believed its pungency drove out rot. Some remedies worked, though no one understood why. Others did nothing but fill the air with strong smells that masked the stench of decay. The tents themselves became their own world. Light filtered dimly through canvas. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of sweat, blood, and damp straw. Outside, soldiers drilled, horses whinnied, fires crackled, but inside, time moved differently. Each hour was measured by groans, by the turning of bodies, by the careful adjustment of bandages. For many nights, waiting was the hardest part. Warriors trained to fight, to act, to lead, were now forced to lie still. Days stretched endlessly. The mind wandered, to the battle, to lost comrades, to fears of death. Some nights grew restless, demanding to rise before their bodies were ready, pulling at bandages, insisting on returning to the field. Others retreated inward, speaking little, their eyes fixed on the canvas above, their thoughts locked in silence. Faith became more important in this stage. Priests and chaplains visited often, offering words of scripture, administering sacraments, reminding the wounded that their suffering mirrored Christ's. Relics were placed near pallets. Fragments of bone, pieces of cloth, tokens said to hold divine power. For some, these objects gave hope. For others, they were reminders of death waiting close by. Not all recovery was solitary. Companions visited, bringing stories from camp, sitting quietly at bedsides. Squires kept constant watch, changing bandages, cleaning wounds, holding cups to parched lip. Bonds between knight and squire deepened in these moments. Loyalty was not measured in battle cries but in the quiet act of wiping sweat from a fevered brow, of carrying waste buckets out of the tent, of enduring the long silence of waiting together. And yet, not all survived. Fevers rose, wounds blackened, bodies weakened. When death came, it was often slow. Breathing grew shallow, words faltered, hands grasped for companions. Priests whispered last rites, candles flickered, and silence deepened. Death in the tents was different from death on the battlefield. It was not sudden or heroic, it was drawn out, ordinary, almost mundane. For those who survived, recovery brought scars, both seen and unseen. Muscles wasted from lying still, bones healed crooked, lungs weakened from fever. A knight might return to his horse, but he limped, coughed, or carried stiffness in his arm. These marks of survival became part of his identity, badges not of glory but of endurance. The body bore witness to the battle long after the field had been cleared. But survival carried another weight, memory. The tent became etched into the mind as deeply as the battlefield itself. The smell of herbs, the moans of companions, the press of fevered cloths, these lingered, returning in quiet moments, haunting nights as much as the clash of swords. In this way, the tent was not only a place of healing but a place where the scars of the soul deepened. So, when we think of knights recovering after battle, do not picture quick triumph or miraculous healing. Picture instead the endless days of waiting, the slow drip of broth from a spoon, the whispered prayers over damp cloths, the silence broken only by groans. Picture the way survival was not decided by skill or strength alone, but by the fragile interplay of time, faith, and chance. But ask yourself this: if a knight's body survived, but his spirit was weighed down by memories of pain, what kind of healing had truly taken place? Was survival enough, or did some wounds remain forever beyond the reach of medicine, faith, or time? The silence of the healing tents was deceptive. It seemed calm compared to the roar of battle, but beneath that quiet hung the constant presence of suffering. In those low-lit spaces, where linen cloths soaked with blood piled up and the air was heavy with the odor of herbs and decay, knights faced their most human moments. What we often forget is that the story of knighthood was not written only with swords and banners, it was written just as much with scars, limps, and memories that never faded. For every knight who emerged whole from combat, another carried a mark. A stitched cut across the face, a stiffened arm that never quite lifted a shield the same way again, a limp from a bone that healed crooked. These were not the glorious marks of tournament scars worn proudly, but the quiet disfigurements that reshaped daily life. Washing, dressing, even mounting a horse became harder. In this way, the tent became a crucible. Those who survived it emerged not unchanged, but altered. Chronic pain was common. Without antibiotics, without proper bone setting, the body rarely healed cleanly. Joints ached with damp weather, wounds reopened with exertion, fevers returned with every winter. A knight's later years were not spent in shining armor but in enduring the slow punishment of old injuries. Medieval chronicles rarely mention this. They celebrated victories, listed deaths, praised feats of arms, but the long half-lives of pain, the weary days of limping through halls or sitting stiffly at council tables, were left unsaid. Yet this was the truer outcome of battle for most. The scars were not only physical. In the silence of the tents, the mind carried its own wounds. A knight lying awake at night heard not just the coughs of companions but the cries of men remembered from the battlefield. Some became restless, unable to sleep. Others grew withdrawn, haunted, reluctant to fight again. Though medieval language did not have terms like post-traumatic stress, the signs were there. Priests noted confessions heavy with guilt. Companions spoke of men who sat quietly for hours, staring into nothing. Survival in the tent was never purely about the body. It was about carrying a spirit marked by what it had seen. Still, knights found ways to endure. Rituals of faith became anchors. Morning prayers, confessions, the sign of the cross before meals, all these gave shape to recovery. Companionship, too, mattered. Squires who refused to leave their masters' sides, fellow knights who shared stories, even the quiet presence of others in pain created a sense of solidarity. Pain was personal, but it was also communal, and this shared endurance gave it meaning. The tents also became sites of unexpected resilience. Some knights, written off as doomed, recovered slowly, stubbornly, against all odds. Their scars became symbols not of weakness but of endurance. A limp could tell a story of survival. A twisted arm could testify to perseverance. In a culture that prized strength, even brokenness could carry its own kind of honor. These scars became part of the knightly identity, woven into the fabric of chivalric memory. From a broader perspective, the healing tents reveal much about medieval life itself. They were microcosms of a world caught between faith and practicality, between ritual and reality. Priests prayed, surgeons cut, squires wiped sweat. Each did their part, not fully understanding the causes of recovery, but committed nonetheless. It was a world of half measures, of gestures both symbolic and practical, stitched together in the hope of survival. What strikes us now is the ordinariness of it. Behind the banners and battles, behind the chronicles of kings and crusades, were countless mornings when men sat in silence on straw mats, waiting to see if fever would break. History is made not only in the clash of armies but in the slow, dull moments afterward, when wounds are tended and breaths counted. The boring details, the changing of bandages, the boiling of herbs, the whispered prayers over pale lips, were the true fabric of medieval survival. And yet, this ordinariness was precisely what gave it power. To endure such moments, to rise from the straw and step again into armor, was itself a victory. Perhaps not the kind sung by poets, but the kind that allowed knights to keep fighting, keep serving, keep shaping the history we know. Without the healing tents, without the patience of squires, without the crude tools of barber-surgeons, there would have been no chivalry to remember at all. So, when you picture knights of old, do not see only the charges across fields or the banquets of victory. See also the quiet tents, the sweat-soaked bandages, the scars that lingered long after the banners were lowered. See the resilience not of steel, but of flesh and spirit. And ask yourself this: if the truest legacy of knighthood was not glory on the field but endurance in the tent, then what does that tell us about the real nature of history? Was it ever about shining victories, or has it always been about the quiet, painful, boring survival that followed? After battle, when the shouting ceased and the fires burned low, exhaustion set in like a weight no armor could block. For a knight, the most precious prize was not gold, not even glory, it was sleep. Yet sleep in a medieval camp was nothing like the comfort of feather beds or castle chambers. It was rough, improvised, and, in many ways, as dangerous as the battlefield itself. Imagine the camp at night. Canvas tents lined the fields, their edges sagging with dew. The ground beneath was uneven, littered with stones, mud, and straw scattered in a half-hearted attempt at comfort. Some nights had cots, wooden frames with stretched fabric or rope. Many more had nothing but straw pallets, hastily laid on damp ground. The armor that had protected them by day now became a burden. Chainmail, heavy and clammy, was stripped off and piled in corners. Gambesons, still damp with sweat, were laid out to dry. The knight himself, bruised and aching, collapsed onto the straw with little more than a blanket to cover him. Straw was both blessing and curse. Fresh straw provided cushioning against the earth, a small relief for sore bodies. But straw also trapped vermin, fleas, lice, and sometimes worse. Within days, it grew musty and foul, pressing its smell into the air of the tents. To sleep in straw was to share your bed with creatures that bit and burrowed, leaving skin raw and itchy. Yet for a knight drained of all strength, even this discomfort was preferable to standing guard. Armor, once removed, could not be far away. Many knights slept with swords within arm's reach, daggers tucked close by. Helmets rested beside pallets, shields leaned against tent poles. In the uncertainty of campaign life, a sudden night raid was always possible. To be caught unarmed was to invite death. And so knights slept lightly, half alert, their bodies twitching at the sound of distant shouts or the neigh of a horse. Deep, dreamless slumber was rare. Sleep was fragile, broken by fear. The arrangement of tents reflected hierarchy. Commanders and nobles had larger pavilions, sometimes with rugs and wooden chests, guarded by attendants at the entrance. Ordinary knights shared smaller tents with squires and sometimes fellow warriors. Privacy was almost non-existent. Snores filled the air, along with the rustle of straw, the coughs of wounded men, and the occasional mutter of nightmares. To be a knight was to share one's rest with the sounds and smells of dozens of other bodies. For squires, the burden was heavier still. Many slept outside their master's tent, curled in cloaks on bare ground, ready to be summoned at any hour. Their nights were shorter, interrupted by calls to fetch water, polish armor, or tend to wounds. Exhaustion was constant, but loyalty demanded endurance. Sleep was not a right but a privilege, and squires often learned this lesson the hard way. Despite these hardships, there was ritual even in sleep. Before laying down, knights often prayed. Some recited psalms, others murmured thanks for surviving the day. Many crossed themselves, entrusting their souls to God should they not wake. Sleep was, after all, perilous. Fever might take a man in the night. An enemy raid might pierce the tent walls. To sleep was to surrender control, and so knights leaned on faith to carry them into the dark. Yet even faith could not quiet the mind entirely. After battle, dreams were restless. Men relived charges, saw again the faces of fallen comrades, heard echoes of screams. Some woke in cold sweats, fumbling for weapons in the dark. Others muttered prayers against nightmares, believing them to be whispers of the devil. The line between rest and torment blurred. Sleep, meant to restore, often became another battlefield of its own. Comfort was relative. On campaigns near towns or villages, straw might be replaced with bedding seized from homes, blankets, rugs, even mattresses. But these were rare luxuries, and they carried their own risks, disease, vermin, and the resentment of displaced villagers. More often, the knight made do with whatever lay beneath him, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders, listening to the night wind shake the tent flaps. It is easy to romanticize the image of knights resting beneath banners, but the truth was duller, harsher, more human. Sleep was not heroic, it was a necessity wrestled from the rough ground, stolen in brief hours, haunted by pain and fear. The straw was scratchy, the blankets damp, the air thick with the smell of sweat, smoke, and unwashed bodies. And yet, for all its discomforts, it was still precious. Because for the night, each morning began again. The ritual of washing, the bite of bread, the tending of wounds, all of it required at least some rest. However shallow, however broken, sleep was the thin line that allowed a night to endure another day. But this raises a question. If nights rested in such fragile quarters, with vermin in the straw and fear in their dreams, what toll did this restless sleep take over weeks, months, even years of campaign life? How much of their strength was truly lost, not on the battlefield, but in the long, uncomfortable hours of the night? To fight a battle demanded strength, but to endure a campaign demanded sleep. And yet, the irony was cruel. Nights rarely had enough of it. In the fragile quiet of canvas tents and straw pallets, rest came in fits and fragments. Over time, this deprivation wore down bodies and minds in ways as damaging as swords or arrows. The first toll was physical. The human body, strained by battle, needed deep rest to heal. Bruises faded slowly, muscles ached longer, wounds resisted recovery when sleep was broken. Fever burned hotter in the sleep-deprived, infections spread more easily. A knight who staggered from bed after only a few hours of restless dozing was weaker, slower, less steady in the saddle. Even the strongest armor could not protect against exhaustion. The second toll was mental. Knights prided themselves on discipline, yet without rest, tempers frayed. Arguments broke out over rations, orders, even straw pallets themselves. A man robbed of sleep grew reckless, irritable, less obedient. Commanders noticed it. Discipline in a camp rose and fell with the quality of the night's rest. Chronic weariness frayed the bonds of loyalty, revealing the vulnerability of even the most chivalric orders. The environment itself offered little mercy. Nights were cold and damp, with mist creeping into tents, soaking blankets and straw. Summer brought heat, sweat, and swarms of insects that bit through cloth. In winter, nights huddled together for warmth, their breath steaming in the air, frost stiffening their bedding by dawn. No matter the season, discomfort was certain, and comfort uncertain. Noise also robbed rest. Horses shifted restlessly, dogs barked, men coughed and muttered in their sleep. Guards called out to one another along the perimeter. In larger camps, the clamor never truly stopped. Blacksmiths hammered late into the night, cooks stirred pots, healers worked by lamplight. Even in supposed silence, the groans of the wounded or the occasional scream of fever made the tents restless places. Sleep was further broken by fear. Every night knew that a camp could be raided under cover of darkness. Stories of night attacks haunted the mind, and vigilance made true slumber impossible. Men slept lightly, one hand near their swords, ears pricked at every sound. In their half-sleep, dreams and reality blurred. A horse's neigh might become the echo of a battle cry, the flap of canvas, the imagined rustle of approaching enemies. Over weeks, this fragile rest compounded into fatigue that shaped the very course of campaigns. Exhausted knights fought more poorly, made slower decisions, lost focus. Commanders understood this, which is why discipline demanded strict schedules of watch rotations and enforced hours of rest. Yet enforcement could not conjure comfort. You could order a man to lie down, but you could not command him to dream without fear. Still, adaptation grew out of necessity. Some nights learned to nap in short bursts, taking minutes of rest in daylight whenever possible. Squires guarded these moments, shielding their masters from interruption. Others turned to ritual to force rest. Prayers whispered before bed, charms hung at tent poles, relics placed near pillows. These practices, half faith and half superstition, gave weary minds something to cling to. If you believed a saint's relic protected your sleep, perhaps you slept a little easier. Nutrition, too, played its role. A stomach full of ale might sedate a knight enough to rest, though it left him groggy by morning. Warm broth calmed nerves. Hard bread did not. In this way, food and sleep were intertwined, one shaping the other, both shaping survival. The deeper consequence of these restless nights was psychological wear. A knight who did not sleep carried battle with him into the dark. Dreams replayed the clash of steel, the screams of dying men. Some woke shouting, swinging fists at shadows. Others muttered prayers against visions they believed were demonic in nature. Without the words we have today, trauma, nightmare, disorder, medieval knights experienced these torments in silence, attributing them to sin, weakness, or the devil's whispers. And yet, within this hardship, resilience emerged. Men learned to function on little, to endure fatigue as they endured hunger. Exhaustion became as much a part of knighthood as armor or sword. To complain was to admit weakness, so most bore it quietly, as part of the burden of their station. Sleep was fragile, but honor demanded persistence. Still, one question lingered, whispered in tents and around fires. How long could men endure this cycle of shallow rest, endless battle, and constant fear before something broke, not in the body, but in the spirit? Could a knight truly be invincible if each restless night chipped away at his very humanity? When dawn broke in a knight's camp, the rising sun often revealed men who had slept, but not truly rested. Their eyes were bloodshot, their movements stiff, their minds heavy with dreams that offered no peace. In the sleeping quarters of medieval war, rest was never complete. What knights carried into the straw at night often followed them into the day. For many, dreams were not gentle but violent. The mind replayed the chaos of battle, the crash of lances, the screams of horses, the sight of comrades falling. These visions surfaced in the half-sleep of exhaustion, indistinguishable from memory. A knight might wake clutching his sword, heart pounding, convinced the enemy had returned. Squires learned to approach their masters cautiously, aware that a startled hand might strike before recognizing friend from foe. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep should restore, but instead it deepened fatigue. Fear of dreams kept men awake, staring into the dark until their bodies surrendered to brief, troubled slumber. In a time when such experiences were framed in terms of sin, demons, or divine punishment, knights bore these burdens in silence. Confession might unburden guilt, but it did little to quiet the night. The body, too, betrayed them. Chronic lack of rest weakened immune systems, leaving knights vulnerable to fevers and infections. Wounds healed slowly, bones ached longer, strength waned. A knight who might once have ridden tirelessly now grew winded, his grip less firm on the sword hilt. Campaigns stretched on not only because of strategy, but because men simply slowed under the weight of fatigue. Sleep, or the lack of it, shaped the pace of war as surely as supply lines or weather. And yet, even in this exhaustion, ritual persisted. Every night, armor was removed, weapons placed close, prayers whispered. Every night, men laid down in straw, however filthy or vermin-ridden, because the act of lying down itself mattered. To attempt rest was a declaration that tomorrow existed. Sleep, however imperfect, was still survival. Still, these were exceptions, and by the next march, the straw awaited once again. For squires, sleeplessness was double-edged. They bore their master's needs, fetching water, stoking fires, tending wounds, and then collapsed into what scraps of rest remained. Some fell asleep sitting upright, heads against tent poles, cloaks wrapped around them. Their exhaustion mirrored their nights, but without the honor attached. Yet loyalty bound them to endure. If the knight stirred at midnight, the squire rose. If a raid came at dawn, the squire was already awake, blade in hand. Their rest was always lighter, always more fragile, because another's survival depended on it. What emerges from this picture is not the romance of banners fluttering in moonlight, but the ordinariness of exhaustion. Sleep was not heroic, but it was the ground on which heroism stood. Without it, no knight could lift his sword the next day. Without it, chivalry itself would have collapsed under the weight of fatigue. And perhaps this is the greatest irony. The legends of knighthood, so full of glory and triumph, were built on a foundation of half-sleeps in straw, of restless dreams, of aching bodies dragging themselves from damp pallets at dawn. History remembers the charges, the victories, the banners. It rarely remembers the men scratching flea bites, yawning through prayers, or rubbing stiff necks as they buckled armor. Yet these moments were just as real, just as defining. So, when you imagine the night at rest, do not picture only the silk-draped bedchambers of castles. Picture the sagging canvas tent, the smell of damp straw, the soft clink of chainmail piled in the corner. Picture a man lying awake, eyes open in the dark, wondering if he will live to see another dawn. And ask yourself this: was it the battles that broke nights, or was it the nights, long, sleepless, restless, that slowly wore them down, one straw-filled hour at a time? When the camp finally stilled and the last embers of the fires burned low, many knights did not surrender to sleep immediately. Before lying down on straw or cot, they turned to something older than armor, older even than the sword: prayer. For the medieval knight, whose days were marked by violence, the night was marked by confession. In the fragile quiet after battle, salvation mattered as much as survival. Knighthood was never only martial, it was bound up with faith. From the moment of initiation, knights were told they bore the sword not just for lord or land but for God. And so, when they stripped off armor at day's end, many also sought to strip the soul of its weight. The battlefield left not just bruises on the body but burdens on the conscience, and the hours before sleep became the time to reckon with both. For some, this meant formal ritual. Priests and chaplains traveled with armies, their tents serving as makeshift chapels. A knight might kneel on damp ground, confess sins to a weary priest, murmur prayers of contrition, and receive absolution before returning to his pallet. Others prayed alone, whispering psalms, tracing the sign of the cross, or clutching rosary beads carved from wood or bone. Words varied, but the intent was constant: to secure the soul against death, which could arrive suddenly and without warning. The prayers themselves were not lofty or elaborate. They were simple, direct, shaped by exhaustion. Forgive me, Lord, for the blood I have shed. Grant me rest, should I not wake. Spare my soul, should the fever take me. These were the phrases muttered into the straw. Sometimes lips barely moved, the words internal, between knight and God alone. Other times, they were spoken aloud, blending into the low murmur of a camp where dozens of men sought forgiveness in unison. The act of praying before sleep was not only about absolution, it was about comfort. In the silence of night, when memories of the day's violence crept in, prayer gave the night something to hold on to. The rhythm of familiar psalms, the repetition of the Lord's Prayer, the tactile feel of a cross between fingers, all these steadied the mind. Faith dulled fear, just as ale dulled hunger. But confession was not always easy. Knights carried heavy doubts. The Church told them that killing in God's name was holy, yet they knew the cries of peasants, the faces of men begging for mercy. They knew the difference between righteous war and opportunistic plunder, even if chronicles blurred the line. In the quiet before sleep, those doubts surfaced. Was the blood on their hands sin or service? Would their prayers be enough to balance the scales? Priests were quick to remind them of penance. Confession cleansed, but action followed. Some knights vowed to fast, to give alms, to dedicate future victories to God. Others promised pilgrimage if they survived. These vows, whispered in tents, linked the violence of war to the rituals of religion, binding the sword to the cross in ways both practical and psychological. Prayer also structured the night. Just as morning began with washing, evening ended with psalms. These small rituals gave shape to time, turning the chaos of campaigns into a cycle. Fight, wash, eat, pray, sleep. Without such anchors, the uncertainty of war might have broken men more quickly. Prayer became discipline, as much a part of knighthood as wielding a lance. And yet, even as knights prayed, they knew not all sins could be washed away in words. Some confessed nightly, fearing sudden death might find them unshriven. Others confessed rarely, convinced their deeds were justified. In both cases, the act of prayer was a negotiation, between steel and salvation, between the reality of violence and the hope of forgiveness. So imagine the camp at night. The low glow of a single candle in a priest's tent, the line of men kneeling outside, waiting for confession. Picture the solitary knight, kneeling beside his cot, whispering psalms while his squire sleeps nearby. Picture the rough wooden cross, clutched tightly as sleep finally comes. These were not moments of triumph but of vulnerability, when men who carried steel all day laid down their burdens and begged for mercy. But this raises a question that haunted many nights. If every day brought new blood, new violence, new sins, was nightly confession enough? Could prayer truly cleanse the soul when tomorrow would soil it once again? To confess sins at night was not merely an act of devotion, it was an act of survival. For nights, the soul's fate was as pressing as the body's. Death was never far. It could come by arrow, fever, or even in sleep. And so, the hours before rest became a kind of spiritual insurance, a chance to settle accounts with God before another uncertain dawn. The church loomed large in these nightly rituals. Chaplains who traveled with armies carried small crosses, books of psalms, and relics. Their tents became sanctuaries amid chaos. At dusk, groups of knights gathered, kneeling in mud or straw, to chant prayers together. The sound was low, rhythmic, dozens of voices murmuring the same verses, their tones mingling with the crackle of campfires. To listen was to hear not only devotion but desperation, men binding themselves to words older than their fears. Confession, though private, was also communal in effect. Knights often queued in silence outside a chaplain's tent, waiting their turn to kneel, whisper, and receive absolution. These lines were long after major battles, when blood spilled weighed heavy on consciences. One by one, men unburdened themselves, though what they admitted varied. Some spoke of pride, gluttony, or neglect of duty. Others whispered of pillage, cruelty, or moments of mercy withheld. The priest listened, nodded, offered penance. Then the knight rose, lighter in soul if not in body, and returned to his tent. Yet confession was more than obligation, it was negotiation. Knights believed their prayers could tip the balance of fortune. A man who confessed and prayed nightly was more likely, they thought, to earn God's protection. Swords might strike others, but faith might shield the faithful. In this way, prayer became part of campaign strategy, not in the hands of generals, but in the hearts of men. Superstition blended with devotion. Relics, bones of saints, scraps of cloth, vials said to hold holy oil, were treasured talismans. Knights touched them before sleep, convinced they carried protection into dreams. Some wore small crucifixes around their necks, kissing them before lying down. Others placed tokens beneath their pillows, a prayer scroll, a pilgrim's badge, a rosary. Faith was not abstract. It was tactile, woven into the physical space where knights tried to rest. But faith could also weigh heavily. Knights were told by priests that wars blessed by the Church, crusades, campaigns sanctioned by papal decree, were holy. Yet in their hearts, many wrestled with doubts. Could God truly forgive the slaughter of peasants? The burning of villages? The theft of food from starving families? In the silence of night, when no banners waved and no trumpets blared, these questions pressed hardest. The sword in a knight's hand felt heavy enough, but heavier still was the question of whether God approved of how it was used. Some knights dealt with this weight by rationalizing. They told themselves that obedience to lords absolved them of sin, that responsibility lay higher up the chain. Others embraced fatalism. Death and sin were inevitable, forgiveness uncertain, so better to fight boldly and pray briefly. And still others clung desperately to nightly confession, believing that as long as they knelt in prayer each evening, their soul was clean for at least a few hours. It is easy to imagine the psychological relief this gave. After washing wounds, eating coarse bread, and settling into straw, to whisper prayers was to reclaim some order. Words repeated night after night created rhythm, a steady beat against chaos. Even if the prayers did not erase guilt, they soothed the mind enough to allow sleep. Yet not all prayers were for forgiveness. Some were for strength, for protection, for the safety of family far away. A knight might ask God to watch over his wife, his children, his lands. Others prayed for fallen comrades, whispering names into the dark, entrusting souls of the dead to divine mercy. In this way, prayer bound together the living and the lost, turning tents into places of memory as much as confession. The weight of sin, however, never lifted entirely. Each morning brought new violence, new temptations, new failures. The cycle was endless. Confess, fight, sin, confess again. The tent became less a place of resolution and more a revolving door of guilt and absolution. The knights knew it, the priests knew it, and yet the ritual continued, because without it, the burden might break them entirely. And so the question lingered. If confession gave peace for the night but guilt returned with the day, was it truly forgiveness, or merely a fragile bandage for a wound that never closed? Knighthood, for all its armor and ceremony, was never far from contradiction. By day, knights waged war, striking down men with iron and fire. By night, many of those same warriors knelt in straw, begging forgiveness for the very deeds that defined their station. It is here, in the nightly rhythm of prayer, that we see the truest tension of medieval knighthood, a life lived between steel and salvation, between sin and absolution, between earth and eternity. For knights, prayer at night was not optional. It was expected, reinforced by the Church, by their vows, by the very culture of their time. To go to sleep unconfessed, unshriven, felt like tempting fate. Death was always near. A raid could cut through the camp, a fever could rise in the night, an arrow could strike at dawn. To die without confession was to risk the soul. And so the nightly ritual became as habitual as sharpening a sword, one form of preparation for tomorrow's battle, another for eternity's.